Playoff baseball is back. I'm Derek Van Riper, host of the Athletics Rates and Barrels podcast. Join Eno Saris,
Mr. Stats Guy,
Britt Chiroli,
how you like them apples,
Trevor May, and I as we dig deep into the key matchups and advanced stats driving the critical decisions throughout the postseason. From the first crack of the bat in the wild card round until the last pitch of the World Series, we have you covered. Check out the Rates and Barrels podcast every day during the postseason wherever you get your podcasts.
College football is back like never before. I'm David Ubben, and I host Until Saturday, the Athletics Leveled Up College Football podcast. 3 times a week, you'll hear me and my co-hosts, fellow Athletics senior writer Chris Vanini and 2-time national champion Damian Harris, embrace the sport's new madness with you. We're also just going to have a ton of fun enjoying all the things that make college football great. Check out the brand new Until Saturday, every Monday, Wednesday, and Thursday this fall. You can find us wherever you listen to your podcasts.
The Athletic.
Hello, and welcome to And Colossally, That's History, the podcast that reappraises motor racing history. I'm Richard Williams.
And I'm Matt Bishop. And we're back with Season 2 of the podcast.
Yep, and it's great to be back, not least because we've got some incredible stories to tell across these next 10 episodes.
Indeed, we have. And I should say a very, very warm welcome back to everyone who listened to Season 1 of the pod and sent us such lovely messages. As Richard says, we're delighted to be back. And if you're new to And Colossally, That's History, a big thanks for joining us, and I hope after listening to this episode, you'll go back and explore Season 1. But as you say, Richard, we've got some great stories to tell in this season, and we're starting with a bang, with an incredible tale of Formula One espionage from the 2000s.
Yep, and on this episode we're going to be diving into a saga that came to be known as Spygate, which, nearly 2 decades on, still feels like one of the most remarkable off-track episodes in F1 history, if not sporting history as a whole. It had a bit of everything, really. Ego, spurned ambition, blackmail, bitterness, vengeance, revenge, and, in the end, a real human tragedy. You name it, this had it. But before we go any further, Matt, what do you make of this gate naming convention? Are you a fan?
To be honest, yeah, I find it a very useful formulation. I mean, it all started with Watergate, of course. The scandal that in the end caused the downfall of President Nixon, Richard Nixon, in the early and mid-1970s. And I often think, actually, if Watergate happened now, it would be called Nixon-gate. Or Watergate Gate. But Watergate Gate is a bit of a mouthful, isn't it? But anyway, for better or for worse, this scandal did come to be known as Spygate, and is still, and it really did shake Formula One to its very core. I was the editor of F1 Racing magazine at the time, and I was therefore right in the thick of reporting it, and it was amazing, remarkable. It all centred around the transfer of confidential technical information or intellectual property, IP, between 2 engineers from F1's 2 biggest and most historic teams, Ferrari and McLaren. Now, in many people's minds, I'm sure the word spy conjures images of James Bond, etc., international espionage, but Spygate wasn't really like that. As is the case with such things, the central act in the scandal was actually remarkably low-tech. I mean, almost comically so. We'll get into that detail a little later, but put it this way. Who would have thought that a photocopy shop on an industrial estate in suburban Surrey would end up playing such a pivotal role in shaping a global sport like Formula One?
Yes, indeed. So shall we start by putting some meat on the bones of this story? It unfolded in 2007 and involved Ferrari and McLaren, who were the 2 biggest F1 teams at the time, despite Renault having won the 2005 and 2006 titles. The two engineers that you mentioned, Matt, who were at the heart of the story, were Nigel Stepney, an English engineer for Ferrari, and Mike Coughlan, his friend and an engineer for McLaren. They were from the same generation. Stepney was 49 at the time and Coughlan was 48, and they'd worked together before at Lotus and Ferrari. As chief mechanic, or capomeccanico, Stepney was a key part of the Ferrari super team that won consecutive titles from 2000 to 2004, with Jean Todt, Michael Schumacher, Ross Brawn and Rory Byrne in charge of the management and design. Stepney was from the West Midlands, and he'd started work as an apprentice with Broadspeed, the tuning firm. Do you remember they used to tune Minis?
I do remember indeed. Broadspeed Minis were
Yep,
big. Well, they were small, but they were big.
Yep.
Yeah.
Then he joined Shadow before moving on to Lotus, where he worked with Ayrton Senna, and then to Benetton, where he first encountered Michael Schumacher. In 1994, he joined Ferrari, working in Maranello, a rather curious role as the liaison man between John Barnard, who was designing the cars from an office in England, whimsically known as the GTO, in this case meaning not Gran Turismo Omologato, but Guildford Technical Office.
Do you think, by the way, they knew that they were doing a pun of that kind?
Yeah, they probably didn't. It probably didn't go down too well.
Probably.
Coughlan was at the GTO as well, working with Barnard on the new F1 Ferrari. Barnard and Coughlan were dismissed when it became obvious that trying to design a Ferrari from Guildford didn't really work. But Stepney had impressed the hierarchy in Maranello, and he stayed on to work with a new technical regime, one with which he was familiar, Ross Brawn and Rory Byrne and Tad Zapsky, all of whom he knew from his days at Benetton. And by that time, he'd sort of gone native. When I interviewed him in 1996, he told me how it had been a struggle to start with at Maranello. There was some skepticism about this English guy coming in among all the Italian mechanics, most of whom came from the villages around Maranello.
Absolutely.
But how he'd come to love the lifestyle, the food, the sunshine, the mountains to ski in, and not least, maybe most, the status enjoyed by Ferrari's chief mechanic.
Exactly.
Two of those guys, his predecessors, Giulio Borsari, who'd worked with John Surtees and Jody Scheckter, and Ermanno Cuoghi, who'd been Niki Lauda's chief mechanic, they'd already written autobiographies of their own. They were famous, and Stepney loved it, loved being their successor. He said to me, "Every bar you go into has a picture of the old man, Enzo Ferrari, on the wall. The biggest problem I have is that wherever I go, everyone wants to talk about Ferrari." And suffice it to say that he never had to pay for a round of drinks in Emilia-Romagna or probably anywhere else in Italy.
I'm sure he did not, no.
So he was very aware of his status, and midway through Schumacher's run of 5 championship seasons, he was promoted from chief mechanic to technical coordinator.
What do you think that meant, technical coordinator?
Chief mechanic and a bit more, probably.
It's
a bit more money.
Like chief mechanics. Well, team managers are promoted to sporting director these days after a while, but their job title changes, but not much else does.
I suspect that was the truth of this too. But then Ross Brawn announced in 2006 that he'd be leaving the job of technical director to take a year's sabbatical, which actually turned out to be permanent. And then Stepney must have felt that he was next in line.
I bet he did, actually. I mean, we'll come to Coughlan in a bit, but I didn't really know Coughlan, but I did know Stepney and I liked him. He was incredibly hardworking. I think we should mention that. Mm-hmm. Very obviously so, actually. And I heard stories of him, he used to go to work and then he would finish work at about 5 or 6 o'clock, go home, have his dinner, and then go back to the factory and work through the evening past midnight and then go home to bed and get up in the morning and go to work again. He worked incredibly hard. But even so, although he wasn't really attuned or interested in my kind of work when I was a journalist and editor, he was always very pleasant to me. Whenever I asked for stuff like access to the Ferrari garage for an F1 Racing magazine photo shoot or whatever. And he and Ross Brawn, as you've mentioned, the Ferrari technical director, were close too, I think, which added to Nigel's gravitas within the Scuderia.
Yeah, and it was a very happy and well-run team at the time.
It
I remember
was.
watching in the pit lane, on practice days, watching Ross doing pit stop practice. The technical director. He was there with his stopwatch, timing them as they practiced doing it, and there was just a feeling of great togetherness about the whole thing. That success was not accidental.
No, and by the way, while we're just ever so slightly going off topic, but it's worth mentioning, a major contributor to that esprit de corps, that team spirit, was Michael Schumacher.
Yeah.
And he because he very much drew everyone together, and it was that small number of very senior people, obviously Michael, John Todd, Ross Brawn, Rory Byrne, but one removed because he wasn't actually always at every race, but he was absolutely behind the design. And Nigel Stepney was part of that.
Yeah, he was. So he'd been very successful there, but of course nothing lasts forever. And they lost the 2005 and 2006 titles to Fernando Alonso and Renault. Then Michael Schumacher retired and Jean Todt stepped back from the day-to-day running of the team. And that's when things began to get a little sour for Nigel at Maranello.
Yeah, you could say that, yeah.
Kimi Räikkönen came in to take Michael's place, and Stefano Domenicali, who's the current boss of F1, took over the running of the team from Todd as Ferrari's management structure evolved. Stepney expected, and maybe he was even promised, a key position in the team during this evolution, a more key position, perhaps. And here's a spoiler alert. He died in 2014. And in his obit for The Guardian, I wrote about his feeling of being thwarted when Mario Almondo was promoted to fill Brawn's role as technical director in 2007.
That's interesting. Obviously, we'll come to his sad death later, but anyway, carry on, sorry.
His pride was definitely wounded by being taken off the team that travelled to the races and basically reduced to an office job at Maranello, coordinating the race and test teams. An important job, but not one in the public eye or one that was, part of the excitement of going to the circuits and being part of what was going on. Technically, it might not have been a demotion, but it would certainly have felt like a loss of status, and undoubtedly that came to be a factor in Spygate.
Yes, absolutely. If you remember, in February 2007, Stepney made a rather odd public statement to the effect that he wanted a change of career direction. I thought that was odd when I read it at the time. And later that month, Ferrari moved him to the factory-based job that you've just described.
Do you think he was right to be upset, Matt? I mean, this kind of thing happens in all walks of life, not just in F1. It's happened to most of us at some time or another.
Certainly happened to me.
Me too. When people are passed over for promotion and they feel wronged or slighted or just overlooked.
Yeah, look, I think it was poorly handled, certainly. I always got the feeling that, that it was a happy team in the way that you describe and the people that we have described contributing to that happiness. But I did always also get the feeling that some of the Italians at Ferrari perhaps somewhat resented Stepney's level of influence and his closeness to Brawn. Whatever the rights or wrongs of the saga, I'm not talking about Spygate now, I'm talking about what happened to Nigel in his, whether it was a demotion or a sideways move or a diminution of his influence, whatever the rights and wrongs of that, it certainly made Nigel feel unloved and unwanted. And together with his old mate Mike Coughlan at McLaren, whom he'd worked with years before in the 1980s, they decided to better themselves. Because don't forget, Coughlan's nose was also out of joint because, although he was earning a decent six-figure sum from McLaren, as was Stepney from Ferrari, I think actually Stepney was on more than Coughlan, but they were both on, I think Coughlan was on nudging $500,000 and Stepney might have been nudging $750,000-ish. But they both envied and coveted the very hefty seven-figure sums being earned by their colleagues, Ross Brawn in Stepney's case and Adrian Newey in Coughlan's case. So the old Lotus muckers decided to club together to sell themselves to Honda as a dream team. It's important to remember that that was their plan. Their plan was to sell themselves to Honda, Nick Fry, as a dream team, bringing all the expertise they'd both assembled during all the time they'd both spent working for Formula One's two top teams, Ferrari and McLaren. There's nothing wrong with that. Their error was taking some of that expertise in tangible and indeed traceable form. 780 pages of Ferrari IP. And by the way, who knows, and I'm not saying this because I don't know this, but of course they would have also, in whether it would have been in tangible or traceable form, part of their offering to Honda would have been a lot of information from McLaren as well, because that's what they were bringing. They were selling themselves as a dream team with expertise from both those teams. Anyway, those 780 pages were more than 3 kilograms of printouts. It was heavy. It's a big lot of technical data, and it included the blueprints for the 2007 Ferrari Formula One car. I mean, that was dumb, and it was also unethical.
Yeah, it's important to note that it's virtually impossible to stop all intellectual property from leaving a team, because people change teams all the time, and you can't remove the contents of someone's brain, nor ask them to unlearn what they've learnt on the job.
Absolutely right. That's why there was nothing wrong with them selling themselves to Honda. The mistake was taking traceable.
Absolutely.
Yes.
I mean, when Adrian Newey joins Aston Martin in 2025, next year, he'll be taking with him all the experience of his decades of designing championship-winning cars with other teams.
Exactly.
That's inevitable. That's what they're paying him 30 million quid a year for.
It's inevitable, and it's unavoidable.
Yep, it is. And we should also say at this point that all F1 teams spy on the opposition to a greater or lesser extent.
Totally.
That's gone on since time immemorial. And it would be remiss of them not to do it. It's an open secret that all the teams employ photographers, the ones who working for agencies or freelance or magazines, to take high-definition photos of rival cars, particularly the bits that you can't easily see. But what we're talking about in this case is the removal of documents and then the passing on of confidential information.
Absolutely. And just to be clear, those spy photographers, as they're sometimes referred to, they don't do anything wrong. They don't do anything cloak and dagger. They don't break into factories or sneak into garages. They basically are told, we want a panning shot of the following cars. And so the photographer then goes and positions himself or herself at a corner or a straight where such a panning shot can be taken, and then takes them. Or we want a rear shot, or we want a rear shot on a straight and a rear shot on a corner to compare the position of the rear wing. And they're taking photographs from areas where photographers are designated and expected to be.
And sometimes they get lucky if somebody sticks it in the wall and the car comes back on a truck and it isn't properly covered, and they get a picture of the floor or the diffuser or something.
Exactly. Or even in accident damage, some of the bodyworks come off and they can take a bit. Yeah. Anyway, we've mentioned, and that brings us to the man to whom the documents were passed, Mike Coughlan of McLaren. Now, as I say, Coughlan started his F1 career with Lotus, where he met Stepney. He then worked with Stepney, actually not only at Lotus, but again at Benetton and tangentially at Ferrari, as he was part of GTO, the GTO, John Barnard's design company, when it designed cars for Ferrari, Benetton and Arrows, actually. Coughlan then became technical director of Arrows before it folded in 2002, after which he joined McLaren. And at the time of the incident being Spygate, he was chief designer. As I say, I think he always felt himself to be a bit of a poor relation at McLaren, because although he was called chief designer, Newey was always the main man.
What was Newey's title?
Was he technical? He wasn't technical director. Was he chief technical officer? Mm-hmm. He might have been. Chief Technical Officer is often the title that's alighted upon when you want to have someone who isn't actually saddled with, having to hire and fire engineers and give them appraisals and do job descriptions and all that kind of thing.
But is the design supremo nevertheless?
Yeah, because you wouldn't want, and indeed Aston Martin won't expect, and they'd be damn foolish if they were to expect, and they won't, Adrian Newey to start writing job descriptions and doing appraisals. He won't. That's not what they've hired him for. Chief Technical Officer, off the top of my head, I can't remember, but that's often the formulation. Anyway, Newey was always the main man there from a design point of view, and by a big margin.
So what people might be wondering is why it was Mike that Nigel passed the documentation to. And as we've said, they knew each other from way back. Old friends was how Coughlan described them. And as you say, Matt, Coughlan too was unhappy with his status at McLaren. So we've talked about the morality of Stepney in taking the documents, but what about the morality of Coughlan in accepting them?
Well, I think the fault was equal and opposite. Two sides of the same coin, if you like. Or if I'm allowed to say this, perhaps two cheeks of the same arse would be more apt. They both knew they were breaking the rules, doing something dodgy, obviously. But as I say, you have to bear in mind that Stepney and Coughlan never intended the Ferrari dossier to be used by McLaren, but by Honda. Perhaps people think I'm saying that because I went on to work for McLaren. Well, all I'm telling you is that I'm saying it because it's the case. And they did have a meeting, Coughlan and Stepney, with Nick Fry at Heathrow. May or may not come to that later on, but that's what it was intended for Honda. I'm not saying anything wrong was done by Nick Fry, because he didn't know about that, but definitely Coughlan and Stepney were selling themselves as a dream team to Honda. But anyway, going back to how the story unfolded, there are a couple of other crucial characters in the story. And the first we really should talk about is a woman called Trudy Coughlan, Mike's missus.
Ah, yes. Had it not been for the actions of Trudy Coughlan running an errand for her husband, Spygate might never have come to light.
Probably wouldn't.
It probably wouldn't. It's a very funny story. In June 2007, she popped into a local copy shop in Hersham with the dossier and asked for it to be copied and transferred to a CD. And she'd come back to pick it up the next day. Can you believe that?
Unbelievable.
780 pages of Ferrari secrets. So, unbelievably, despite the copy shop being right in the heart of McLaren country in Surrey, the person running the shop, a chap called Gary Monteith, happened to be, guess what, a massive Ferrari fan.
You couldn't make it up.
If you tried to get that into a plot of a movie, you'd be thrown out of the script conference. So Gary Monteith does what his customers asked him to do, but in the process, he spots that what he'd been copying looks like a bunch of confidential Ferrari documents. And so, being a Ferrari fan, he finds a way to send an email to Stefano Domenicali, the boss of Ferrari, with the subject line, industrial espionage.
Which would have got Stefano's attention.
It sure would. And don't ask me how he managed to get Domenicali's contact details, but he did, and he wrote and explained that he's a big Ferrari fan, and this is what's happened. And what he's written in the subject line, as you said, gets it noticed.
Naturally, and rightly, Ferrari felt duty-bound to investigate the matter. So they called a British lawyer who spoke to Monteith, the guy who worked in the copy shop, to find out more detail. And that, in turn, led to them getting a court order, and just before breakfast, 7:30 a.m., I think, on July the 3rd, 2007, lawyers arrived at the Coughlan household in Surrey just as Mike was getting ready to go to work. They seized 2 CDs containing the Ferrari document, because the original 780 pages, the original documents had been shredded, then incinerated in the Coughlan's back garden.
And that feels like a good time for our first ad break.
Now, just before the break, we mentioned lawyers going to the Coughlan household on July the 3rd, 2007. But actually, there were developments with Stepney before that, weren't there? That were tangentially, why do I keep saying tangentially? Never mind, that were tangentially connected and equally extraordinary. I'll try not to say tangentially one more time, Richard, I promise you.
Well, yeah, not at all tangentially. back in May, ahead of the Monaco Grand Prix, Stepney was accused of sabotaging his own team's cars. In a leaked police report, Ferrari staffers speak of seeing him loitering on 2 occasions near Raikkonen's and Felipe Massa's cars in Monaco before they found powder sprinkled in and around refuelling tanks and in the fuel tank, actually in the fuel tank of Raikkonen's car. Stepney's trousers were analysed and powder was found, believed to be detergent or perhaps a nutritional supplement. Not an internal combustion engine supplement, obviously. But Stepney always insisted that he'd been set up as part of a dirty tricks campaign to force him out of a team whose management he was increasingly at odds with. In any case, he was suspended, and Ferrari later decided to pursue criminal charges against him. But what do you think, Matt? Do you believe Stepney would sabotage a car, or was he set up?
Well, I was just listening to you going through that little saga within a saga. Obviously, I remember it and know it, but I always, look, I'm going to use another gate formulation. I always regarded White Powdergate
Yes.
as a bit of amdram, a bit of amateur dramatics, really. I mean, I have no idea whether it was true or not, or if there was a grain of white powder of truth in it, or what it signified. I mean, to me, it all felt a bit too Agatha Christie, and even if it were true, so what? There was never any proof that Stepney had sabotaged the Ferraris, and in my view, call me naive, but in my view, it wouldn't have been in his interests to do so. Detergents, nutritional supplements, I'll leave that to Hercule Poirot and Miss Marple, I think. Anyway, whatever. In June, it had been announced that Stepney would be the subject of a criminal inquiry conducted by, and this is now my turn to do what you do better than me, which is to drop in Italian pronunciations into things. It would be the subject of a criminal inquiry conducted by the Procuratore Distrettuale, district attorney in Modena. But Ferrari added no further detail to that announcement. And then the following month, on the very day that the lawyers raided Coughlan's house, in fact, Ferrari sacked Stepney.
And what we haven't touched on yet was that all of this unfolded at a time when tensions on the racing side of things had been rising for McLaren too. Fernando Alonso had joined the team as double reigning world champion, and he looked and probably expected to be the clear number one in the team in 2007.
Just to be clear, so he'd won the championship in 2005 and 2006.
And 2006,
exactly, yes.
So as champion, his car, his McLaren, carried the number one, with the number two on the car of the British rookie Lewis Hamilton. But Lewis proved far more capable than Fernando was expecting, and maybe even better than McLaren had expected.
Yeah, I think so.
He was on the podium at every one of the first 5 races of 2007, and he won the 6th in Canada. And temperatures had already started rising, actually, at the previous race in Monaco, when McLaren asked Hamilton to hold station behind Alonso rather than attacking him for the win.
That's right, and Alonso did win that race, in fact, didn't he?
He did.
Yeah.
Then Lewis's win in Canada, the next race, gave him the lead in the championship. And when he won again in the USA, Fernando was very unhappy. He claimed that the team weren't siding with him as the number one, and that they were happier when Lewis won. So Ron Dennis was having to manage very carefully a delicate situation between two hugely ambitious, very capable drivers, one an established champion and the other a newcomer to Formula One.
Yeah.
So by the time of the British Grand Prix, when the Stepney firing and the Coughlan suspension were announced, Lewis was actually leading Fernando by 14 points, with the Ferrari drivers Massa and Raikkonen 17 and 22 points back, respectively. And McLaren was also comfortably ahead in the constructors' standings. What do you remember of the tensions between Lewis and Fernando and how Ron was handling it? He'd had Senna and Prost before, of course, so he knew how things could escalate between a couple of very competitive teammates. But Fernando was often saying quite incendiary things in the Spanish press, and Ron always looked quite stressed.
He did, yeah. Poor old Ron. I mean, he always thought, Ron always thought he was very good at handling drivers. But, oh dear, I'd have to say this. But in fact, It was always one of his weaknesses. He'd hate hearing me say that. I hope he's not listening, but perhaps he is. Probably isn't. But you only have to ask the drivers themselves. All the drivers that have driven for him, generally they would agree with what I'm going to say. They respected Ron's towering ambition. Of course they did. And rightly so. And it was that quality in him that kept them coming back for more, because it was Ron's insatiable desire to succeed and his tactical nous that meant that under his leadership, McLaren was almost always a team in which they could win Grand Prix and win World Championships and also earn a load of money while doing so. But managing drivers, no, Ron wasn't always great at that. He wasn't always a great empath in that way. And he certainly hadn't expected Lewis to compete on level terms with Fernando in 2007. No one had.
Even though he'd spotted him as a very young
he knew how good he was
and brought him through.
Yeah, he knew how good he was, but I don't think he thought he was going to take on and often beat the man who had won not just the last, but the last 2 world championships. I mean, Fernando Alonso, then as now, brilliant driver, one of the best we've seen. And the idea that a rookie could just jump in a Formula 1 car and beat him or match him, no, I don't think anyone did really think that. I thought that Ron would have thought that he would learn, if not at Fernando's knee, then certainly in his shadow and, pick up his setup advice, etc., etc. And very soon there was no setup advice going in that direction. Anyway, no, I don't think anyone had really expected Lewis to compete on level terms, and certainly not even Ron. And this is relevant, I think. I had a conversation about this very subject with, of all people, Nigel Stepney in Sao Paulo in 2006, the previous year. Will you let me have a little bit of a reminisce?
By all means.
Okay. Well, I was staying in the Grand Hyatt Hotel in Morumbi in Sao Paulo. This is Brazilian Grand Prix 2006. And there'd been a mix-up. On race day morning, I discovered that the journalists with whom I was sharing a hire car had left without me. Irritating. Anyway, these things happen. So I was forced to hang around the lobby, waiting for someone I knew from, with any luck, I might be able to cadge a lift. Anyway, a few people came out and they were team people, but they're not necessarily people I knew. And then out of the elevator marched Stepney. So I asked him, could I have a lift, Nigel? Is that possible? And he said yes. So he and I drove together in his tiny Fiat rental car, by the way. No airs and graces for him at that point. Tiny, ropey little Fiat Punto or something. Actually a Palio, I think it was, which was a South American model. Anyway, we drove from the hotel to Interlagos. Now, it's not a lot of miles, but it's a lot of minutes because the traffic's bad, as you know. Anyway, we chatted about this and that, and one of the subjects we touched on was Hamilton. And I said, do you think he's going to do well against Alonso at McLaren next year? Obviously, I can't remember his reply verbatim, but I can remember his reply. And it was along the lines of, no, he won't be able to live with Alonso. And then he added this, in fact, I regard Heikki Kovalainen as a greater prospect than Hamilton. That seems amazing now, because Hamilton's won 950,000 Grand Prix, and Heikki won one.
I wonder if it explains, in a very small way, part of the reason why Stepney didn't actually get any further with Ferrari.
Well,
perhaps he wasn't the greatest judge, the greatest,
maybe.
Strategist.
I mean, that you may well be right. I mean, in his defence, Lewis was a rookie. He hadn't done that much testing. Heikki Kovalainen had been the test driver at Renault the year before and had done 30,000 kilometres or something in the days when testing was a weekly thing. But I agree with you.
It's the job of senior management in F1 to be able to see that talent coming a long way.
And he was mistaken.
And Ron could.
Yes.
For instance, and Ross Brawn could.
Yes, and no, you're quite right, because Stepney was quite wrong. Kovalainen, by the way, who I worked with at McLaren in 2008 and 2009, lovely guy, but no, he wasn't a greater prospect and he wasn't a greater driver than Lewis Hamilton, and nobody is suggesting that he was, but Stepney did suggest that he would be on that drive. And Coughlan did race in 2007 alongside Fisichella at Renault in 2007, as you recall. And by the way, that was Nigel Stepney's last ever Grand Prix, as it happens. So I was his passenger, his sole and only passenger, as he drove to a Grand Prix for the very, very last time.
Perhaps that was the end for him as far as he was concerned, giving a journalist a lift to the track in a rental fee.
Or maybe he thought that, the great honour of driving an F1 racing journalist his career couldn't go higher.
Of course. Of course.
No, anyway, I just remember it because it was such a strange thing that, of course, I didn't realise it was a significant moment, but it was a significant moment for me because I was there sitting next to him the very last drive he ever went to a Grand Prix, having been working in the sport for the thick end of 30 years. Anyway, going back to Fernando and Lewis, yes, ultimately it was their on-track rivalry, which was fierce and became fiercer, that led to the next phase of Spygate unfolding, and we'll get to that. But before we do, Richard, it's probably worth us, or because I've rabbited on about Fiat Paleos and all the rest of it. By the way, I do remember that Nigel Stepney's double D clutch heel and toe down changes were very good.
What, no synchro in a South American Fiat?
There was synchro, but he just did it to make it smoother. As we went into the roundabouts, he was heel and toeing. Old habits die hard. Proper racing guy. Anyway, it's probably worth your describing what happened in the immediate aftermath of those remarkable announcements of British Grand Prix week.
Yeah, because an awful lot happened in the next few days and in the weeks that followed. As we said, Stepney was sacked by Ferrari and Coughlan was suspended by McLaren. And on the 4th of July 2007, McLaren announced that it had conducted an investigation and concluded that no Ferrari intellectual property has been passed to any other members of the team or incorporated into our cars.
I think I remember Ron using such a Ron phrase at a forthcoming race soon after that. I can't remember what it was. And he talked about whether or not Ferrari IP had permeated the membrane of McLaren. Do you remember him saying that?
I do not, but it's an entirely perfect bit of Ron speak. Permeated the membrane.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, he invited the FIA to permeate the membrane of McLaren, in fact, after that, and to inspect the cars and to confirm what he'd said. And on the 6th of July, Honda issued a statement confirming that Stepney and Coughlan had approached the team regarding, quote, job opportunities, unquote, in June 2007, previous month, speaking, I believe, as we've said, to Nick Fry.
I believe so. And by the way, to be clear, we're not accusing Nick Fry of having done anything wrong here.
No, it's just perfectly normal approach.
Perfectly normal.
We don't know his response to it.
Yeah. And we're not saying that they were taking the dossier. We're just saying they intended the dossier to help them sell themselves as a dream team to Honda.
Yep. And a few days later, on July the 12th, this is 2007, the FIA announced that it had summoned McLaren to an extraordinary meeting of the FIA World Motorsport Council. And at the hearing on July the 26th, we learnt all sorts of things, including the fact that Stepney had whistle-blown to Coughlan earlier in the season about the flaw used by Ferrari en route to victory in Australia, which was subsequently deemed illegal. I mean, that's pretty extraordinary, isn't it?
Yeah.
One guy on one team telling the rival, we're doing something illegal.
Because they had their sights set on a bigger, richer goal.
Very much,
yeah.
And it just shows that they were operating in tandem.
And if not technically unlawfully at that point, ropily and dodgily.
Sure. They met again in Barcelona. They'd met in April at a meeting sanctioned by McLaren, although McLaren insisted the purpose of the meeting was so Coughlan could tell Stepney to stop getting in touch. As it happens, this was when the dossier was passed. And the World Council deemed that McLaren was in possession of confidential Ferrari information and was therefore in breach of, wait for it, Article 151C.
The famous, infamous 151C.
Yeah, keep that one in your back pocket. Of the International Sporting Code, which prohibits any fraudulent conduct or any act prejudicial to the interests of any competition or to the interests of motorsport generally. But, and this is pretty crucial, it said there was no evidence that McLaren had used this information, so no punishment was levied. Matt, what did you think of that decision at the time? Surely you didn't think that that would be the case closed?
No. Well, look, at this point, I think we have to mention, it's been a bit of an elephant in the room throughout our chat so far, but we have to mention the mutual dislike that existed between the McLaren boss, Ron Dennis, and the FIA president, Max Mosley. Ron despised Max. He despised him. And actually, a couple of years before Spygate, in a one-to-one interview I was doing with Max, I remember that I actually asked him whether he despised Ron. And he asked to go off the record. I can say it now because he's passed away. Well, he's dead. He died in a way that perhaps we couldn't describe as passed away. But anyway, he's no longer with us. Anyway, I remember asking Max if he despised Ron, and he asked to go off the record and said, "No, I pity him." And he spat the word pity in the way that I've just tried to do. There was real venom there. So no, I think I realised in mid-2007, as many of us did, many of us who were in and around Formula One, you must have, that Max had his shovel under Ron and he wasn't going to let him off in a hurry.
Do you think snobbery had anything to do with it? And Max was a very, hard to find a more patrician example of the English upper classes than Max.
Well,
and Ron had begun, as he doesn't like us to remember, as a mechanic.
I think you're right. I mean, don't forget, Max was disgraced because he was born of Sir Oswald Mosley. That was his father, who was the leader of the British Union of Fascists in the 30s and during the war, and was interned with his mother, Diana Mitford, during the war. But don't forget, Max Mosley, get this in terms of a lineage, Max Mosley was related to the Queen Mother on one side and Sir Winston Churchill on the other.
Yeah,
I mean, very patrician.
On the other hand, his best mate was Bernie Ecclestone, the son of a trawlerman.
And he
had no problem spending a lot of time with Bernie.
But that was partly because I think once his father, we'll have to do a podcast one day about Max, but because his father rendered him no longer able to be part of the establishment, rendered Max, he found bedfellows in odd places, one of which was Bernie Ecclestone.
But I sort of asked you that question.
I do agree with you.
Well, I don't agree with myself, actually.
Well,
I asked you that thinking, I don't think it was snobbery. I think he just genuinely despised him.
I think it was intellectual snobbery. I think he thought, he respected intellect, Max. Yeah. He liked jousting with people he thought were intelligent, even if he disagreed with them. And he could be withering if he thought you were not a conversational foeman worthy of his effort. Yeah. And he thought Ron was a conversational foeman not worthy of his effort. Yeah. He might have been wrong about that, and some of that may have been snobbery, some of it may have been intellectual snobbery, some of it may have been the class system in England. Some of it may be. Don't forget, Max was expensively educated in England, Ireland, France and Germany. Ron went to the local secondary modern and then went to Guildford Tech to do motor vehicle engineering as a what I think was called Citizens Guilds at those times, and became a mechanic, as he doesn't like to have us remember. So I do think there was an element of that. Yeah. And there was venom there, and I don't think he was going to let him off. I think they were already, but I don't think Max despised Ron. Or his word was pity. Ron despised Max.
Well, anyway, when the FIA let McLaren off, Ferrari labelled the decision incomprehensible. and were furious. And as you say, Max plays a big part in the story from now on. And here we get our first major intervention from him, because he uses his personal powers to reopen the case and give Ferrari an opportunity to appeal that September. So that brings us up to speed on all the off-track matters, heading into the Hungarian Grand Prix, where Spygate is about to be blown wide open once more.
Indeed so, and maybe that feels like a good time for our second break. Throughout the World Motorsport Council hearing and in the civil court hearings, McLaren were insistent that no team member knew about the existence of the Ferrari dossier before the legal action began in the run-up to Silverstone. But an explosive weekend on track at the Hungarian Grand Prix resulted in a chain of events that meant we'd soon learn that that wasn't quite true.
Yeah, it was in Hungary that the simmering Hamilton-Alonso rivalry and the fight for supremacy within the McLaren team boiled over. Our sister podcast, Bring Back V10s, recently did a really fascinating episode on Hungary 2007, so I urge you to go and listen to that for a full and detailed account of everything that happened that weekend, because there's much more than we can possibly cover here. But the flashpoint came in the final segment of qualifying, when Hamilton disobeyed a team order about which driver was to exit the pits first, and Alonso took retribution into his own hands by deliberately balking Hamilton in the pit lane ahead of their final qualifying runs, so he wouldn't have enough time for a final flying lap.
I remember it so well. It was so dramatic.
Yeah, it was a very smart thing to do if you were Alonso, wasn't it?
He was a smart and is a smart cookie.
Yeah, he was. Anyway, predictably, Ron Dennis hit the ceiling, and we got those amazing TV shots of him slamming his headset down and storming up the pit lane before grabbing Alonso's physio. Alonso was later given a 5-place grid drop for impeding Hamilton, and McLaren were told that they wouldn't be allowed to score any constructors' points that weekend.
I always thought that was a bit of a weird extra. I can understand the 5 places, but not able to score constructors.
Yeah.
That was a bit...
It is a bit odd. Strange thing to tack on, but yeah. I suppose they're saying to Ron, get control of your drivers.
And he had lost control of his drivers.
Yeah. Anyway, the team seemed on the brink of civil war. Matt, you were talking to Ron a lot at this stage, and I believe you were also at the post-qualifying Meet the Team media session with Ron, Lewis and Fernando. Had Ron really lost control?
Oh, my goodness, yes. That Hungary 2007 McLaren press conference, Meet the Team it was always called, do you remember?
I do.
Was a total disaster. Yeah, I was talking to...
It was a sort of attempt to humanise Ron, I think, really,
yes.
Wasn't it? Meet the Team.
Meet the Team. And Mercedes, which was the engine partner of McLaren then and now, they liked it. They wanted it to happen, to humanise the whole thing. Anyway, it was a total disaster. I was there, and I was talking a lot to Ron at the time. In fact, I was soon to join the team. I hadn't done so yet. But anyway, that's another story. Well, first of all, Lewis didn't even turn up. We didn't even turn up on time. So it started with Ron, Fernando, and Norbert Haug. You remember Norbert Haug?
Very well.
Of Mercedes-Benz, McLaren's engine partner, then as now. And I was still a journalist at the time, and we all assumed that Lewis had decided to go to see the stewards to complain about Fernando instead of attending the press conference. And he probably had. Wherever he was not on parade at the beginning of Ron's press conference. And that's just something that didn't happen at McLaren. It didn't happen in any team, really. You just turn up with your team principal, particularly one as, senior, first among equals, as Ron would see himself, as Ron. Anyway, the McLaren Brand Centre, it was called, the big black-fronted, curved glass motorhome.
Was that new at the time?
Newish.
Something that they'd introduced.
Yeah, it was newish. Very forbidding and snazzy, if you can be both forbidding and snazzy, it was. Anyway, it was absolutely jam-packed. I remember, in my mind's eye, I'm thinking of it now, standing room only. And all these tricky questions were being hurled by journalists at Ron. And he didn't really know what to say because he clearly hadn't had a chance to quiz Lewis properly. Lewis had gone somewhere straight after, and, there they were without him, without Lewis, facing the music, facing the press. So Ron didn't know what Lewis was thinking, and Fernando was enjoying it enormously. Not saying much, but he was also subtly tormenting Ron in a very Fernando way. And by the way, I've worked with Fernando later on. I worked with Fernando in 2015, 2016 and 2017, and I found him very good to work with. But obviously at this time, when I wasn't working with him, because I hadn't joined McLaren until 2008, it was very tense. Anyway, Ron is, as we all know, a stickler for neatness. And he thinks fruit should be eaten on a plate with a knife and fork. You steady the fruit with the fork and then you slice pieces off with the knife. Yet here was Fernando eating a very ripe and juicy fruit. From memory, I think it was a peach, but it could have been a pear or an orange or a nectarine, something like that. And he was eating it with his hand, biting into its juicy flesh, slurping it, and allowing its juice to run down his chin.
I would love to have seen, I wasn't there, I'd love to have seen Ron's face.
It was hilarious. And he knew exactly what he was doing, slurping noises, and I remember it running down his chin. Anyway, hilarious. And very deliberate on Fernando's part. Anyway, Norbert could have helped take some of the heat off Ron, but he didn't say a word. In fact, he was playing with his mobile phone, BlackBerry, that dates it, doesn't it, with his BlackBerry throughout. And then Dave Ryan, McLaren's sporting director, team manager, sporting director, appeared, and he began to wave at Ron and called him over to come urgently because he was wanted by the stewards. By this time, Lewis had arrived. Obviously, Lewis had left the stewards, I think, and the stewards wanted Ron. But the press conference continued, but now without Ron. Just the two drivers and Norbert, who was still head down, busy with his BlackBerry. It went on a while, and it became, very, very, very indisciplined and unstructured. I think the press officer at the time was on holiday, perhaps. So it was all a mess. And after a while, Martin Whitmarsh, Ron's number 2 at the time, intervened and brought the most fractious meet the team there'd ever been to a close. And I actually think it was that episode, that was when Ron finally realised that he needed strategic help from a comms, PR, media point of view. The next race was in Istanbul. And that's where Ron called me into his brand centre office and offered me a job as McLaren's comms chief. I was just lucky. I was just in the right place at the right time. Perhaps I wasn't the best person for the job, but I was in the right place at the right time because Ron knew me and he needed someone quick. Anyway, he offered me the job. I said yes, but I had to finish my...
Also, let's face the facts. You do know how to eat a piece of soft fruit with a knife and fork.
I've never tried it, but I should now try it. Yeah. But in front of Ron, I would not have slurped a peach and let it run down my chin. Let me put it that way. Anyway, I couldn't join straight away because I had to finish off my gardening leave with Haymarket, which was then the publisher of F1 Racing. So I started in January 2008, but I agreed to join in Istanbul 2007. And as a result, it's worth saying, I was then made aware of things that perhaps many other journalists hadn't yet been. For instance, in Hungary, we're going back to Hungary 2007, this extraordinary weekend. So the next morning after that extraordinary and fractious meet the team, on race morning, Fernando, absolutely furious about what had happened in qualifying the day before, met Ron in the McLaren brand centre and allegedly threatened to send to the FIA his email exchanges with McLaren's then test driver, Pedro de la Rosa, unless McLaren would run Lewis out of fuel that afternoon, according to Ron. I say allegedly because, of course, I didn't hear it, but it is according to Ron. And Ron said that once Fernando said that, he then asked Martin Whitmarsh to join them and asked Fernando to repeat the demand, which he did. This is Ron's version, and it may well be true. I'm just making that disclaimer because I didn't hear it. But anyway, Ron was not about to be blackmailed, so he phoned Max then and told him what had happened. But he said that Fernando's was an idle threat because no such emails existed.
But it was the substance of the emails, if they existed, that was the key, wasn't it?
Well, it was, but also telling Max they didn't exist when they did exist. Perhaps Ron didn't know that they existed at that time, but it was still injudicious, if I may say so, to tell someone like Max that they didn't exist when you hadn't done absolutely careful due diligence to make sure that they didn't exist. So that was an error, because they did exist, it turned out. And worse, their existence and discovery dismantled the notion that within McLaren only Coughlan knew about the Ferrari dossier. And worse still, it turned out that Max already knew about the emails anyway, because Fernando had already told his manager, who was the Renault team principal Flavio Briatore. And of course, Flavio always told Bernie Ecclestone everything. So he told that snippet of juicy information to Bernie, and Bernie told Max.
That may be the most F1 story of all time, don't you think?
Absolutely. I mean, poor Ron, again, trying to, in good faith. I don't think Ron was lying. He thought that there was no way such emails existed. And therefore he told Max. And Max must have just listened, sitting there thinking, ha, 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 I already know you're talking. What you are saying is untrue. You may not be lying, but what you are saying is untrue, and I know it.
Thanks to a chain that went from Fernando to Flavio to Bernie to Max.
Exactly. Poor Ron. Poor Ron. He was blindsided to all of that. Anyway, on the 5th of September 2007, the FIA announced that it had received new evidence regarding the case and that it would consequently reopen the investigation on the 13th of September. This was a very Max move as well. The drivers were offered a deal whereby they could reveal everything they knew in exchange for not receiving any individual punishments. They were always going to reveal everything they knew, therefore. And Ron, bless him, I like Ron. I'm grateful to Ron. I ended up working with him for 10 years later on. But anyway, Ron played Max all wrong in those days. I always used to say the following, if I may say this, because I think it's worth saying and it's probably relevant here. I always used to say the following: Bernie Ecclestone wants to be rich, and by the way, succeeded. John Todd wants to be obeyed. Think about that, obeyed. Napoleon, etc. Ron Dennis wants to be loved, I'll come back to that, and Max Mosley wants to be feared. And, okay, the Ecclestone and Todd bits, people aren't surprised when I tell them that. Of course Bernie wants to be rich. Of course Jean wanted to be obeyed. But Ron wanted to be loved? Absolutely, yes. Admired too, but also loved, definitely. And Max, he wanted to be feared? Oh, yes. Max was a big admirer of Niccolò Machiavelli, from whom the adjective, of course, Machiavellian is derived, meaning cunning, unscrupulous, using clever and sometimes devious means to get what you want. And there's a quote, a Machiavelli quote that I've written down. I'm going to read it. It's not long, but it's worth listening to. He said, Machiavelli, "It is much safer to be feared than to be loved, because love is preserved by the link of obligation, which, owing to the baseness of man, is broken at every opportunity for their advantage. But fear preserves you by a dread of punishment that never fails." In other words, if you think being nice to people will get them to do your bidding, think again. No, you have to make them fear you. Then and only then will they do your bidding. Max once cited that Machiavelli quote when I was chatting with him off the record over a coffee. And then Max added, this is his words, not Machiavelli's. I remember him saying, apart from triggering a man's fear, the only other sure-fire way to get him to do your bidding is to trigger his greed. Threaten him or bribe him, I guess he meant. Let's be honest, Max was very far from being a pussycat, even though he could be disarmingly charming when he wanted to be, as I know,
Sure,
you've had dinner with him, haven't you,
Yes,
Richard?
He was delightful when he wanted to be. And
But don't cross him.
Utterly charming.
But don't cross him.
No, of course not. I mean, he had enormous power.
Enormous power. And he was merciless. Yeah. But Ron understood none of that. He also didn't understand that a man like Max, not only ruthless, but also vain. By the way, Max would deny that if he were with us still, but he was vain, was susceptible, therefore, to flattery. Ron should have gone on bended knee to Max and begged for forgiveness.
Acknowledging his power.
Yes,
yeah.
Acknowledging his power, as you so rightly say. Mea culpa, I am sorry, how can I make it up to you? He should have said all of that. Instead, he harped on about his unimpeachable integrity.
As he did quite a lot.
He did a lot, and that merely antagonized Max all the more. It's an interesting point, because when later a Renault engineer was later found to be in possession of McLaren IP, which you may remember, Flavio flew to Monaco to see Max. Max was living in Monaco at that point. Flew to Monaco to see him and played it exactly right. He got on bended knee and begged for forgiveness. And as a result, Max took pity on him and let Renault off scot-free.
Yep. And when the FIA hearing happened on the 13th of September, we learnt that Alonso, De La Rosa and Coughlan had exchanged information on a variety of topics, utilising Coughlan's detailed knowledge of Ferrari's car and how the team was running it. Yeah. But the FIA's World Motorsport Council didn't have sufficient evidence to prove that any complete Ferrari design was copied and subsequently wholly incorporated into the McLaren car. Nevertheless, it was concluded that it is difficult to accept that the secret Ferrari information that was within Coughlan's knowledge never influenced his judgment in the performance of his duties. It went on, it's not necessary for McLaren to have copied a complete Ferrari design for it to have benefited from Coughlan's knowledge. So McLaren was hit with a whopping $100 million fine.
Yeah.
I believe to this day that's still the biggest sporting fine ever issued. It was about just north of 60 million quid in those days, yeah. I think, $100 million. Half of it was in cash, and the other half was the money the team lost, forfeited, when all their points were removed from the Constructors' Championship, in which they would have finished first. But the drivers were allowed to keep their points, not least because the FIA, Max, wanted to preserve the box office appeal of a title fight between Ferrari's Raikkonen and McLaren's Hamilton and Alonso. Matt, when you heard about the unprecedented extent of the penalty, what did you think? Was it proportionate? And how did Ron take the results of the hearing?
Yeah, I mean, $100 million, it was astonishing at the time. In his own autobiography, Max's own autobiography, which, by the way, is a surprisingly boring book, considering what an interesting person he was to talk to.
Oh, well, he says that in introducing the book, he says, I'm terribly sorry, I'm not going to write about my family.
Yeah.
His extremely interesting and controversial family.
But it's not the only thing that's not... It's not the only miss in that book. It could have been so much better. Anyway, in his own autobiography, Max alluded to the suggestion, the famous suggestion that, quote, it was $5 million for the offence and 95 for Ron being a twat. That's what he wrote, except, I'm sorry to say this, except the word he and Bernie actually used when they coined that little witticism. The word began with a C, not a T.
Max said that was Bernie, not him.
He did say that, yes, he did say that. But it definitely, it had a T in it, but it began with a C. Anyway, that was an accurate summary, I believe. I reckon 5 million was about right. 100 million was punitive, nasty. But no, it didn't surprise me.
Given that half of it had to be paid in cash. Where did it come from? That's a lot of money.
McLaren had the money.
30 million quid?
Yes, McLaren had the money. And, this is the point, because it could have been a whole lot worse. And I'll come back to that, because it allowed McLaren to continue. Because at one point, Max had been toying with the idea of banning McLaren from the 2008 Formula One Championship. They couldn't race at all. In other words, at the end of 2007, the next race they would have been allowed to race in would have been at the beginning of 2009. And that would have been the end of the team. Finito. End of story. And I think it was Bernie who persuaded Max that killing McLaren off would be a bad idea for the sport. And therefore they hit on the $100 million fine, which could be paid by lost Constructors' Championship earnings, as you've described, and a raid of what Bernie had a very good idea of what was sitting in McLaren's coffers. Mm-hmm. So it was doable. It was very difficult, but it was doable for McLaren. Whether without Bernie's intervention, Max would have actually allowed McLaren to die, we don't know. It wouldn't have surprised me. He was incredibly fearless, Max.
Well, he said in the autobiography that, he wished that that's what had happened, that they'd been banned for 2008, and regardless of the consequences.
And I think the consequences would have been dire. The sponsors would have all run for the hills, because the team would have been in breach, because one of the things you have to do if you're deliver for your sponsors is appearing in races, and if you're not going to do that, you're in breach. They'd have all run for the hills. Staff would have been poached. Drivers would have been poached. It would have been the end of
McLaren. They'd have lost a year's racing development and
all that. Yeah. Anyway, Max loved the drama of it all. It's an interesting point. He was fiendishly intelligent, and I'm choosing both those words carefully because, yes, he was intelligent, but yes, also fiendish. I was there at Spa when he and Ron enacted the infamous handshake on the steps of the McLaren Brand Centre, which I think was the idea of Norbert Haug of Mercedes, who wanted to show that there was some rapprochement, even though there really wasn't. And also, I think part of the idea also came from Richard Woods, who was the director of communications for the FIA at the time, but very much in the spin doctor mode. He wasn't promoting the sport of Formula One so much as doing Max's bidding in whatever Max wanted, whatever grief Max had going at the time. Yeah. And by the way, I like Richard, and he's very able, but very much what was called a spin doctor at the time.
Trying to steer things Max's way.
Excellent and clever at it. Yeah. Anyway, the handshake, it was no rapprochement. Ron agreed to it, I think, because Norbert said, please do it. And also his back was against the wall. Ron's back was against the wall. And he thought refusing it would be a bad idea. But it probably belittled him in some way, I think.
So against all this turmoil and to cap off an extraordinary season, McLaren somehow conspired to lose the driver's title to Ferrari's Kimi Räikkönen at the final round in Brazil.
Adding injury to insult.
Completely. And then later in early December, McLaren finally accepted that a number of McLaren employees had access to Ferrari technical information and apologised that it took the intervention of the FIA for this to come to light.
That was Martin Whitmarsh's famous, quotes, grovelling apology letter, wasn't it?
Yeah. And it had been a season that had shaken the team to the core. But how do you think the events of 2007 affected both Ron Dennis and the team in the long run, not only financially, but also psychologically?
Let me answer it this way. When I arrived at McLaren in January 2008, I found an extraordinary atmosphere, which I've often termed, when thinking about it and talking about it, as terrified and defensive pessimism. That's what it was. And it was the result of the way Max had deliberately tormented them all, Ron principally, but all of them, over the previous few months. And I remember in January 2008 and February and March, the beginning of the season, even normal questions. I mean, stuff like, should we invite the media to a dinner in Bahrain? Questions like that were met with answers like, how would that play with Max? Would he think that was too triumphalist? Should we show more contrition?
That is truly extraordinary.
It was honestly like that.
Yeah, it shows although the sums of money are enormous, what a small world Formula One
I know.
was.
And then there would be drilling down into detail. Okay, Matt, you can invite some journalists to a dinner in Bahrain, but not more than 12 and no music. And the reason was to not antagonise Max Mosley. Extraordinary. And there was people earning 6 and even 7-figure sums in the McLaren technology at Woking, agonising over that degree of detail.
Paranoia.
Well, as I've said, terrified and defensive pessimism. And that is why winning the first Grand Prix of the year in Melbourne was so incredibly emotional.
In 2008.
In 2008 for the McLaren team. Because after that winter, when many of those employees thought, we are goners, we're going to be done for, this team is going to come to an end, I'm going to be out of work. And the senior people, it will have happened. The team that Bruce McLaren founded in 1963 will come a cropper under my watch, on my watch. And then instead of that, we went to Melbourne in 2008 in March, and we won. Lewis Hamilton won. And I don't think I've ever seen, honestly, so many grown men cry as a result of a Grand Prix win.
Well, among them wouldn't have been Max Mosley.
He might have been crying. He wouldn't have been.
Maybe not.
He would have been planning his next move.
He would. I'd had lunch with him at the end of 2007, that extraordinary and turbulent season, at his usual place, a restaurant called Daphne's.
Ah, Daphne's.
Fashionable place in Chelsea, around the corner from his home, which is sort of around the back of Harrods.
Walton Street, wasn't it?
Walton Street.
Yeah.
I wanted to give him the chance to reflect on the events of the year, and I think he was quite amused by having his lunch paid for by The Guardian, actually. He called it a brilliant season, which had benefited from Spygate in terms of attracting public attention. Certainly did. In sporting terms, he said the championship was fascinating and very exciting down to the last few laps, which is how it should be. He told me he was relieved that Raikkonen had won the driver's title, although he still thought that a total ban on McLaren for 2007 and 2008 would have been the right thing to do.
Well, yes.
And he was very scornful of Ron Dennis's continued claims to have known nothing about the existence at McLaren of the Ferrari documents. And this is what Max said to me. Every time I speak to him, he still assures me that he would never tell a lie, that he's never told a lie, and that he hasn't lied to us. When you've known somebody for 40 years, it's very difficult just to say, well, I don't believe you. But in the end, no hard-nosed lawyer or policeman would believe it for a moment. But I'm probably just being a bit of a wimp about it. I don't think Max was ever a wimp about anything much.
Absolutely not.
So, Matt, obviously McLaren won the title with Lewis in 2008. But do you think the team has ever really recovered from Spygate?
Well, I think that 2008 season, that's another podcast, because it was the most extraordinary season. You couldn't make it up. To win the World Championship, which Lewis Hamilton did, not only in the last race, not only in the last lap of the last race, but the last corner of the last lap of the last race. And to do so against the old enemy Ferrari, who had tormented you or co-tormented you with the FIA the previous year. You couldn't make that up. And in some ways that exorcised or cauterized the wounds of Spygate, you could say. But I think, therefore, McLaren has, yes, totally recovered from Spygate. The team that is now in 2024 winning races yet again and doing so well, yeah, I think they have completely recovered. But Ron may not have.
Do you think the residue of Spygate was in any way a factor in Ron eventually, for all his huge achievements, eventually losing control of the company and leaving it?
I think that happened in 2016, really, and that was for other reasons. But, there was, I think it was, we talked about Spygate. There's another gate 2 years later, which is Liegate, which we haven't got time to go into. But I think Liegate was very much instrumental in Ron stepping back and focusing more on McLaren Automotive and leaving the race team more to Martin Whitmarsh. But then it was quite a few years farther on that Ron finally...
These things can have a persistent effect, though,
They
can't
can.
they? They can undermine someone's authority or even their self-belief.
And look, Ron was incredibly upset, incredibly depressed. Don't forget, and it did affect him. It affected him personally. I mean, his marriage came to an end soon after. I'm not saying that was connected, but it may have been connected. We all know, if you're deeply depressed about something that was so important to you, and McLaren was so important to Ron, it affects every aspect of your life, and certainly including your closest relationships. Anyway, that's not really something I can speak about with any authority, Ron's love life, and I'm not going to embark on it now.
Another time. But to round off this episode, we should probably do a bit of a postscript and look at what happened to some of the characters involved in the story. Alonso, of course, left McLaren after a single season and rejoined Renault, where he was involved in yet another gate, Crashgate, in 2008. And he rejoined McLaren in 2015, where he worked with you, Matt.
He did.
Gary Monteith, the man from the photocopy shop in Hersham, was invited to Ferrari's end-of-the-season party and celebrated as a hero. Stepney and Coughlan were both handed 2-year bans from the FIA, preventing them from working in motorsport. In 2009, Coughlan was ordered to pay a fine of €180,000 in exchange for the Italian courts dropping charges against him.
Yeah.
He returned to F1 with Williams in 2011 as chief engineer. I think he was brought in by Adam Parr when Sam Michael was leaving. But he left in 2013 when the team was in trouble again.
Yeah.
Nigel Stepney fought allegations against him until September 2010, when he agreed a plea bargain with the Italian prosecutors. He was handed a 20-month prison sentence, which he wasn't required to serve, and a small fine. But he continued to deny sabotage.
What we'd call a suspended sentence.
A suspended sentence, yeah. He went on to work in other forms of motorsport, sports car racing and other things. But very sadly, he was struck and killed by a lorry on the M20 in 2014. He'd stopped his van between junctions 10 and 9, switched off the lights, locked the doors, got out and jumped in front of a truck. The police officer who conducted the investigation concluded it was probably suicide, but an open verdict was recorded by the coroner, stating a lack of evidence. It was a very sad end for a man who left a partner and 4 children, and who, in his time, knew what it was like to be the toast of every bar in Italy.
Indeed so. Very, very sad, yes. And it was kind of the coroner, really, to record an open verdict, but yes, it was suicide. Just 3 days before, he wandered out onto the M20 in the path of a big truck, in the middle of the night, I think it was as well. Mm. Stepney had taken out 2 new life insurance policies.
So, all these years on, how do you reflect on Spygate now, Matt? Do you think it changed the sport?
Well, it's a good question. If Spygate had never happened, and it was written into a Formula One related film script, again, as you've said earlier in our conversation, some of these elements of the story would mean that it would be rejected out of hand as too fanciful. But it did happen. It happened for many, many reasons. But one of the reasons is because the dramatis personae, the characters in the story, at the time were larger-than-life characters who disliked one another, and were perfectly capable of acting fearlessly. They didn't have the checks and measures on them that employees do, even very senior employees. These were people who were masters of their own destiny, rich in their own right. And yes, they disliked each other. But no, I don't think it changed the sport. And why not? Because those larger-than-life characters aren't around anymore. Obviously, Bernie's alive, Ron is alive, Flavio's alive, John Todd is alive, Max isn't alive. But none of them are involved, kind of exception of Briatore, in any way in the sport of Formula One. So the sport has changed. And in that respect, it's changed for the better.
It's the sort of thing about which you could say, oh, it could never happen again. But that's like saying there's never going to be a World War III, isn't it? You know, it's unwise.
Yeah, I think the only reason...
The factors are still in play in the sport.
They are. And let's say Toto Wolff and Christian Horner do not like each other. And they have a great animus and they have a great rivalry and they would be very happy to do each other down. But they don't have the protection of, even though they're both rich men, they don't perhaps have the protection and therefore the untrammeled courage, braggadocio, brass neck to behave in the way that some of these characters did.
Yeah. And that feels like the perfect time to say, and colossally, that's history. A big thank you for joining us for this epic first episode in Series 2. We really hoped you enjoyed it. And if you did, please pass it on to a friend who you think might like to listen to.
Yes, please do. Or, if you have the time, we'd absolutely love for you to leave us a nice review on your podcast app of choice, if you wouldn't mind. And as we always say, we genuinely do love hearing from you. And if you want to get in touch, you can reach us on podcasts@the-race.com or via social media. I'm on @theBishF1 and Richard is on @rwilliams1947.
And if you're part of the Race Members Club, you'll be able to catch the bonus chat that Matt and I did about this episode exclusively for members.
That's right. And if you want to join the Members Club and enjoy ad-free and bonus episode of the Race's many podcasts, check out the link in the description. And while we're plugging stuff, we also now have some And Colossally That's History merchandise. Merch, I believe it's called. Available to buy from the Race shop. There's a couple of T-shirt designs, one featuring the podcast artwork and a Colossally notebook too. Again, there's a link in the description if you want to buy some of our merch and show off your love for, or at least support of, or enthusiasm for our podcast.
And I think that'll do it for now. Until next time, goodbye.
Goodbye.
History.
The Athletic.